My great-grandfather's inheritance came with a key to a safety deposit box, and what I found inside explained why our family has been running from the same town for generations. I was 23 when great-grandpa Silas died, leaving me everything in a will that shocked our entire family. Not because of the money, though there was plenty, but because everyone else had been completely cut out. Why her? My uncle demanded during the reading. She barely knew him. The lawyer handed me an ornate brass key along with the deed to great-grandpa's house in Millbrook, a town I'd never heard of until that moment. He left specific instructions, the lawyer said, consulting his notes. The key opens safety deposit box 247 at Millbrook First National. She's to go alone. Mom grabbed my arm as we left the office. Don't go to that place, she whispered, her face pale. There's a reason we moved away before you were born, a reason we never talk about the old days. But I'd never been one to leave mysteries unsolved. The more she refused to explain, the more curious I became. 2 days later, I drove the 4 hours to Millbrook, a town that looked like it had been frozen in time since the 1950s. Empty storefronts lined Main Street, their windows dark and dusty. The few people I saw moved slowly, watching me with suspicious eyes that seemed to recognize something familiar in my face. The bank was a small brick building that felt more like a mausoleum than a financial institution. The bank manager, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hartwell, led me to the vault with obvious reluctance. "You sure you want to do this, honey?" she asked, her voice strange and strained. "Some boxes are better left unopened. Some family secrets are kept secret for good reason." Inside box 247, I found 3 things that made my blood run cold. A stack of yellowed newspaper clippings bound with string, a leather journal filled with my great-grandfather's careful handwriting, and a faded photograph of a young woman who looked exactly like me. Same dark hair, same green eyes, same stubborn jawline. The newspaper headlines told a story I wasn't prepared for. Local girl vanishes during Harvest Festival. Search continues, 1953. Second missing. Girl found. Dead near Mill Pond. Police baffled, 1954. Mysterious deaths continue. Families fleeing town, 1955. Mill Pond drained after 4th death. Officials claim accident, 1955. But it was the journal entry dated October 31st, 1955 that made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped the pages. They know what I saw that night. The thing that comes for our women, one by one, wearing their faces afterward. It's been feeding on us for generations, and we've been too afraid to fight back. I've kept quiet for 20 years, but it's getting stronger. The families who know the truth are leaving Millbrook tonight, but it follows us wherever we go. It can smell the bloodline. The only way to stop it is to... The entry ended mid-sentence. The next page had been torn out, leaving only ragged edges. Mrs. Hartwell was watching me when I emerged from the vault, her eyes filled with something that looked like pity mixed with fear. "You found it, didn't you?" she asked quietly, glancing around the empty bank as if something might be listening. "Found what?" "The reason your family runs. The reason none of you ever stay in one place too long. The reason your great-grandfather changed his name and spent 70 years looking over his shoulder." My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Get out of there, now. Don't ask questions, just drive away and never look back." Before I could respond, another message appeared. "It knows you're back. I can feel it watching our house. It looks like Melissa, but it's not her. It's asking about you." My hands were trembling as I stared at Mom's texts. Mrs. Hartwell was still watching me with those knowing, frightened eyes, and suddenly the small bank felt like a trap closing around me. "What does she mean, it knows?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What exactly is my family running from?" Mrs. Hartwell glanced around the empty bank, then gestured for me to follow her to a back office. She locked the door behind us, pulled the blinds closed, and turned on an old radio to mask our conversation. "Your great-grandfather was my uncle," she said, settling heavily into her chair. "Silas Hartwell. He changed his name to Thompson when he fled Millbrook in 1955, just like the rest of them did, just like they all had to do." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Your family? Distant, but family nonetheless. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out an identical brass key, along with a manila folder thick with documents. He wasn't the only one who left something behind, and he wasn't the only one who knew the truth. The story Mrs. Hartwell told me over the next hour defied everything I thought I knew about the world and about my own family's carefully hidden history. It started in 1953 during Millbrook's annual Harvest Festival, a celebration that had been held every October 31st for over a century. The festival drew families from neighboring towns to enjoy food, games, and the traditional bonfire that marked the end of autumn and the beginning of the dark months. That year, something changed. Something woke up. The first girl to disappear was Rebecca Morrison, Mrs. Hartwell explained, spreading additional newspaper clippings across her desk. 17 years old, engaged to be married to your great-grandfather. She vanished from the festival grounds sometime after midnight. They found her dress by the old mill pond, but no body. 3 days later, Rebecca returned home. Her family was overjoyed, Mrs. Hartwell continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Rebecca claimed she'd gotten lost in the woods, survived on berries and stream water. She seemed perfectly fine, just a little quiet, a little different. But within a week, Rebecca's younger sister had gone missing, then Rebecca's mother, then her aunt. One by one, the women in Rebecca's family started disappearing, Mrs. Hartwell said, and one by one, they'd come back a few days later with the same story. Lost in the woods, survived on their own, just a little different each time. The journal entries revealed what my great-grandfather had witnessed that Halloween night in 1953. He'd been 17, working late at his father's lumber mill, when he heard screaming from the direction of the festival grounds. I ran toward the sound, he'd written in his careful script, found Rebecca by the mill pond, but she wasn't alone. Something was with her, something that looked like her, but wrong. Its face kept shifting, like water disturbed by stones. When it saw me watching, it smiled with Rebecca's mouth but too many teeth. It spoke with her voice, but the words were backwards, inside out, like someone trying to speak a language they'd only heard in nightmares. By 1955, a third of Millbrook's female population had gone through the same terrifying cycle: disappearance, return, and the gradual contamination of their families. The men started noticing the changes first: wives who no longer cooked their favorite meals, but instead prepared dishes that smelled like rotting flowers; daughters who stared too long at their own reflections, sometimes for hours at a time; mothers who spoke in whispers about places that didn't exist, and people who had never been born. Your great-grandfather wasn't the only one who saw it, Mrs. Hartwell explained. There were maybe a dozen families who knew the truth. They started meeting in secret, trying to figure out what to do. Some wanted to fight it. Others wanted to expose it to the authorities. But in the end, they chose survival. The torn page from the journal, it turned out, hadn't been lost. Mrs. Hartwell produced it from her desk, the final entry that revealed my great-grandfather's desperate plan. The only way to stop it is to starve it, the entry continued. It feeds on family connections, on the bonds between mothers and daughters, sisters and aunts, grandmothers and granddaughters. When it takes a woman, it uses her face and her memories to lure the others. But if the families scatter, if we break those connections and never speak of this place again, maybe it can't follow us all. Maybe it will go dormant, waiting for someone to return and wake it up again. The plan was both simple and heartbreaking. The families who knew the truth would leave Millbrook forever on the same night, splitting up and moving to different states under new names. They would avoid staying in one place too long, never speak of Millbrook or what they'd witnessed, and most importantly, they would never allow their daughters to learn about their true heritage until it was absolutely necessary. For 70 years, it worked, Mrs. Hartwell said. The families scattered like seeds in the wind. The creature had no one left to feed on. Millbrook became a dying town, forgotten by the outside world. Tourist maps stopped including us. GPS systems started routing people around us instead of through us. We became invisible. But you stayed, I pointed out. Her smile was infinitely sad. Someone had to watch. Someone had to make sure it didn't spread beyond Millbrook's borders. And for decades it seemed dormant, sleeping. The mill pond grew stagnant, then dried up entirely. The old festival grounds became overgrown with weeds. We thought maybe it had finally died. Until what? Until your cousin Melissa came back 3 months ago. My blood turned to ice. Melissa was my mom's niece, barely 22 and always the adventurous type. Last I'd heard from the family, she was backpacking across Europe, sending postcards from Prague and Vienna. She showed up at the bank asking about the same safety deposit box, Mrs. Hartwell continued. Said she'd inherited a key from her grandmother and was curious about her family history. I tried to warn her, told her some family secrets were kept secret for good reason, but she wouldn't listen, thought it was just small-town superstition and old-fashioned thinking. What happened to her? Mrs. Hartwell's expression grew grim. She checked into the Sleepy Inn on Main Street. 3 nights later, she disappeared from a locked room on the 2nd floor, vanished sometime between midnight and dawn. They found her clothes folded neatly on the bed, her passport and money untouched, but no sign of struggle, no sign of how she could have left without being seen. And she came back 2 days later, walked into the diner on Main Street like nothing had happened, said she'd gone for a hike in the state forest and gotten lost, had to sleep under the stars. Seemed perfectly fine, just a little different. The familiar pattern was starting again, but this time with a modern twist that made it even more terrifying. Over the past month, 3 more women had gone missing from Millbrook, all tourists or newcomers who had no connection to the original families. A college student researching local folklore for her thesis, a travel blogger documenting forgotten American towns, a genealogist tracing her own family history. They'd all returned with variations of the same story, the same subtle wrongness that the old-timers remembered from 70 years ago. It's feeding again, Mrs. Hartwell said. Learning, adapting, and now that you're here, now that it knows there are more of the original bloodlines out there, it's going to start hunting in earnest. My phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from Mom, each one more frantic than the last. When I finally checked them all, my hands started shaking. Leave now. Don't go to the house. Don't trust anyone who looks familiar. It knows you're there. I can feel it watching. The same feeling from when I was a child. Please, baby. Just drive away and don't look back. Forget about the inheritance. Something's wrong with Melissa. She's here, but she's not here. She keeps asking about you. It's at the door now. It looks like you, but older. It says it's your sister, but you don't have a sister. The final message was a photo that made my stomach lurch. It showed my mom's front door, taken from inside the house. But reflected in the door's glass panel was a face that looked exactly like mine, down to the last detail, except for the eyes. The eyes were completely black, like pools of oil, and the smile was stretched too wide across features that were somehow both familiar and utterly alien. I have to go home, I said, standing so quickly I knocked over my chair. My mom is in danger. You can't, Mrs. Hartwell said firmly, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. The moment you leave Millbrook, it'll be able to track you. It'll follow you like a bloodhound, and it'll know exactly where to find every member of your family, every connection, every relationship, every person who shares even a drop of your blood. Then what am I supposed to do? Let it kill my mom? Mrs. Hartwell released my wrist and walked to an old filing cabinet, pulling out a folder even thicker than the first one. There might be another way. Your great-grandfather and the others, they didn't just run blindly. They spent 2 years researching, planning, looking for a permanent solution. They left detailed instructions. a way to fight back if it ever woke up again. The folder contained hand-drawn maps of Millbrook dating back to its founding, architectural diagrams of the old mill and surrounding buildings, and pages upon pages of research about local folklore, indigenous legends, and the town's hidden history. According to the documents, the creature wasn't native to Millbrook. It had been deliberately summoned and bound to the area. The town's founder, Josiah Millbrook, was more than just a businessman, Mrs. Hartwell explained. He was an occultist, a student of what he called practical spiritualism. He claimed he could summon a protective spirit to guard the town from raiders, wild animals, and hostile native tribes. What he actually summoned was something from a place between dimensions, something that fed on human connections and family bonds. The ritual that bound the creature to Millbrook was performed at the mill pond on Halloween night 1847. For over a century, it had remained relatively dormant, sustained by small offerings during the annual harvest festival, typically just a few drops of blood from willing participants, or the occasional accidental death that the townspeople attributed to natural causes. But in the early 1950s, something changed, Mrs. Hartwell continued. World War II had brought new people to town: factory workers, military families, war brides from Europe. The population doubled in just a few years. More people meant stronger family bonds, more complex relationships, richer feeding grounds for a creature that survived on human connections. It had woken up hungry after decades of meager sustenance, and it had tasted something more nourishing than anything it had experienced before. The families who fled weren't just running away, Mrs. Hartwell said. They were trying to starve it back into dormancy, and it worked for a while. But creatures like this don't die easily. They just wait. According to my great-grandfather's research, the same ritual that had bound the creature to Millbrook could potentially banish it permanently, but only if performed correctly and at enormous personal cost. It requires a blood relative of the original families, Mrs. Hartwell said quietly. Someone with a direct connection to those who witnessed its awakening. The ritual has to be performed at the mill pond on Halloween night, exactly 170 years after Josiah's original summoning. The summoner has to offer themselves as a willing sacrifice, creating a connection strong enough to pull the creature back into whatever dimension it came from. I stared at her in horror as the implications sank in. That's tonight, Halloween night, and you're saying I'm the only one who can do it? Yes. And according to the research, you're also the only one left who carries enough of the original bloodline to make it work. The weight of generations settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. Every family that had fled Millbrook, every life that had been disrupted, every connection that had been severed to keep this thing contained. It all led to this moment. To me, standing in a bank vault in a dying town, holding the key to ending a nightmare that had lasted for over a century. What exactly does the ritual involve? I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. Mrs. Hartwell opened the journal to a page I hadn't seen before, written in a different hand, shakier, more desperate. This was written by Josiah Millbrook himself. Shortly before his death in 1848, he realized what he'd done, what he'd brought into the world. He spent his final year trying to find a way to undo it. The ritual was horrifyingly simple in its requirements, though the execution would be anything but easy. At the stroke of midnight on Halloween, a blood descendant of the original witnessing families had to enter the mill pond, which would need to be filled with water again, and offer themselves as a willing sacrifice. The creature, drawn by the strongest family connection it had ever encountered, would be pulled back into the void between dimensions. But the person performing the ritual, I began, doesn't survive, Mrs. Hartwell finished quietly. The connection works both ways. When the creature is banished, it takes the summoner with it. The sacrifice has to be complete, willing, and irreversible. I thought about my mom, probably barricaded in her house while something wearing my face tried to convince her to open the door. I thought about all the families who had spent 70 years running, never able to settle down, never able to feel truly safe, always looking over their shoulders for signs that the nightmare had found them again. There has to be another way, I said desperately. Some loophole, some alternative that doesn't require me to die. Mrs. Hartwell shook her head sadly. Your great-grandfather spent decades looking for alternatives. He consulted with historians, anthropologists, even other occultists. This is the only way to stop it permanently. Any other approach just risks making it stronger. My phone rang, the sound sharp and startling in the quiet office. Mom's number. I answered with trembling fingers. Hello, sweetheart. The voice was perfect. Mom's exact tone, her familiar warmth and affection, but something was subtly wrong, like a song played just slightly off-key. Mom, I'm so glad you called. I was worried about you driving all that way to that awful old town. But I have wonderful news. Melissa is here visiting. She's been telling me the most interesting stories about Millbrook and our family history. Did you know we used to live there? Put Mom on the phone, I said, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. A pause that lasted just a fraction too long. Then laughter that sounded almost but not quite human. Oh, darling, I am your mother. Don't you recognize my voice? Don't you trust me? If you're really my mom, tell me what you used to call me when I was scared of thunderstorms. Another pause. Sweetheart? I called you sweetheart. That was wrong. Mom used to call me her brave little storm watcher and would sit with me by the window, pointing out the different types of lightning. It was a specific private memory that only the real mom would know. I'm coming home, I said into the phone. No need. The thing wearing my mother's voice replied, and now I could hear the wrongness more clearly. Too smooth, too controlled, like someone reading from a script. I'm coming to you. We're all coming to you. The whole family wants to have a reunion in Millbrook. Isn't that wonderful? We can all be together again, just like the old days. The line went dead. Mrs. Hartwell was watching me with grim understanding. It's bringing them here, I said. It's bringing all of them here, she nodded. It's learned from last time. Instead of letting the families scatter again, it's going to gather them all in one place. Feed on all the connections at once. Build up enough strength to spread beyond Millbrook's borders. Through the bank's front window, I could see cars pulling into the town square. More vehicles than Millbrook had probably seen in decades. Even from a distance, I could make out familiar faces stepping out of the cars. My Aunt Patricia, my cousins David and Michelle, family members I hadn't seen in years. They all moved with the same strange, synchronized gait, their heads turning in unison toward the bank like flowers following the sun. They're not really your family anymore, Mrs. Hartwell said gently. Whatever that thing is, it's wearing their faces, using their memories and personalities like masks. But the people you love, the real people, are gone. I watched my Uncle Richard get out of his car and smile at me through the window. His smile was too wide, stretching his face in ways that shouldn't have been possible, and his eyes reflected the streetlight like an animal's. How long? I asked. How long has it been taking them? Based on what I've observed, probably months. It started with Melissa, used her connections to find the others. Your aunt first, then your uncle, then your cousins. Each one led it to the next branch of the family tree. More cars were arriving in the town square. I counted at least 15 people who looked like family members, all standing perfectly still in the gathering dusk, all staring at the bank with identical smiles that never wavered. The mill pond, I said, turning away from the window. You said it dried up. How am I supposed to perform a water ritual without water? Mrs. Hartwell led me to a large map of Millbrook mounted on her office wall. There's an underground spring that feeds the pond. Your great-grandfather's notes include instructions for reopening it. The mechanism is hidden in the old mill building, a series of floodgates that were installed when they tried to drain the pond in 1955. She traced a route with her finger from the bank to the mill pond, avoiding the main streets where my possessed family members were gathering. Follow the alley to Elm Street, then cut through the cemetery to reach Mill Road. The mill building is about a quarter-mile past the pond. There's a basement level where they used to store grain. The floodgate controls are down there. What about you? I asked. What happens to you when this is all over? I'll stay here, she said simply. Try to keep them distracted as long as possible. Give you time to reach the mill and prepare the ritual site. She pressed an old brass locket into my hand. This belonged to your great-grandfather. He said it might help focus the ritual energy. The locket was warm to the touch, almost hot. When I opened it, I found a small photograph of the same woman from the safety deposit box, Rebecca Morrison, along with a lock of dark hair that looked remarkably like my own. She was the first victim, Mrs. Hartwell said quietly, but also the key to everything. Rebecca Morrison was your great-great-grandmother. The creature didn't choose your family randomly. You're connected to its very first kill. The family connection went back even further than I'd realized. The creature hadn't just happened upon our bloodline. It had been feeding on us for generations, using each victim to find the next, building a web of connections that spanned nearly 2 centuries. I slipped out the back door into the cold October night. The alley was dark, lit only by a few scattered streetlights that cast long, dancing shadows between the dumpsters and abandoned storefronts. Every step echoed off the brick walls, and I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see familiar faces watching me from the darkness. The cemetery was worse. Ancient headstones leaned at odd angles like broken teeth, and bare tree branches created a maze of shadows that seemed to move independently of the wind. More than once, I thought I saw familiar faces watching me from behind the monuments. My grandmother, who had died when I was 12, my cousin Tommy, who had been killed in a car accident 5 years ago. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there except empty air and the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. Mill Road was a narrow strip of cracked asphalt that wound through dense woods on both sides. My flashlight beam seemed pathetically small against the vast darkness pressing in from all directions. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every distant owl call made me freeze and listen for the sound of footsteps. I was halfway to the mill pond when I heard them behind me, the synchronized footsteps of at least a dozen people walking in perfect unison. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted me to know they were coming, wanted me to feel the pressure of their approach like a storm front moving in. The old mill building appeared first in my flashlight beam, a hulking structure of rotted wood and rusted metal that had been abandoned for decades. Beyond it, I could see the depression where the mill pond used to be, a perfectly circular basin about 50 feet across, now filled with nothing but dead leaves and broken branches. According to my phone, it was 11:15 p.m., 45 minutes until Halloween officially began, and with it, my only chance to end this nightmare permanently. I broke into a run toward the mill building. The basement was exactly where Mrs. Hartwell had said it would be, accessible through a door that hung open on broken hinges. My flashlight revealed a stone-walled chamber filled with the remnants of old machinery, grain storage bins, conveyor belts, and in the far corner, a series of metal wheels and levers that looked like they controlled some kind of hydraulic system. The floodgate mechanism was more complex than I'd expected, but my great-grandfather's notes were detailed and precise. I had to turn 3 different wheels in a specific sequence, then pull a large lever that would open the underground channels connecting the mill pond to its natural spring source. At 11:30, I heard the first sounds of water beginning to flow. By 11:45, the pond was half full and rising steadily. At 11:50, I heard them approaching, the soft shuffle of feet on the wooden bridge that crossed the stream leading to the mill pond. Whispered conversations and voices I recognized but knew were wrong. They were taking their time now, savoring the moment, confident that I had nowhere left to run. I waded into the frigid water as the clock on my phone struck 11:58. The cold was shocking, stealing my breath and making my muscles clench involuntarily. But I forced myself to wade deeper, following the instructions in my great-grandfather's journal. The ritual required me to reach the center of the pond where the water would be over my head, where I would be completely surrounded by the element that had originally bound the creature to this place. "There she is," called a voice that sounded exactly like my mom, but with an undertone of hunger that made my skin crawl. "Come back, sweetheart. The water's too cold for swimming. You'll catch your death." I turned to see them all standing at the water's edge, my entire extended family, or the things wearing their faces. In the moonlight, their eyes reflected light like animals, and their smiles never wavered, never changed, as if they'd been carved from wax. "You don't have to do this," said the thing wearing my aunt's face. "We can all be together now. One big, happy family. Isn't that what you've always wanted?" 11:59. I took a deep breath and dove beneath the surface, clutching the locket in my fist. The water was darker than anything I'd ever experienced. A darkness that seemed to have weight and substance, pressing against me from all sides. But I could feel the locket in my hand growing warmer, almost burning against my palm, and somehow I knew that Rebecca Morrison was with me, guiding me through the final moments. At exactly midnight, I opened the locket underwater and spoke the words my great-grandfather had written, letting the water carry my voice into whatever dimension lay beyond our reality. "By blood and bone, by water and will, I call you back to the darkness from whence you came. Take me in place of all the others. Let the families be free." The water around me began to glow with a sickly green light, and suddenly I wasn't alone in the pond. The creature was there with me, but this time I could see its true form, not the stolen faces it wore above the surface, but what it really was underneath. It was vast and ancient, a writhing mass of shadows and hunger that had been feeding on human connections for longer than my family had existed. All the women it had taken over the decades were still there, trapped within its form, their faces shifting and blending like smoke in the wind. It spoke without words, directly into my mind, its voice like the sound of drowning. "You would trade yourself for them? Even knowing they are already gone? Even knowing I have worn their faces for months, years, generations?" "Yes," I said, surprised by my own certainty. "Even knowing that your sacrifice will not bring them back? Even knowing that the people you love are nothing but memories now, echoes I keep for my own amusement?" The revelation hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't waver. "Yes." "But you do not understand," the creature continued, and now I could hear something like fear in its voice. "You cannot banish me because I am part of you. We are family, you and I. Blood of my blood." It showed me images then, memories stolen from generations of my ancestors. Rebecca Morrison hadn't just been the creature's first victim in Millbrook. She had been chosen specifically, deliberately, because she carried something in her bloodline that the creature needed, something that would allow it to create hybrids, children who were part human and part something else entirely. "Your great-great-grandmother bore my child," the creature whispered, "as did her daughter and her daughter's daughter. Each generation, the bloodline grows stronger. Each generation, you become more like me and less like them." The horrifying truth crashed over me like a wave. My family hadn't just been victims of the creature, we were its descendants. The very thing that made me capable of performing the banishment ritual was also what connected me to the monster I was trying to destroy. "You cannot unmake me," the creature said, "because in unmaking me, you unmake yourself." But even as it spoke, I could feel the locket burning against my palm, and I remembered something Mrs. Hartwell had said. Rebecca Morrison hadn't just been the first victim, she'd also been the one who'd helped my great-grandfather understand how to fight back. She had found a way to resist the creature's influence even after being taken. "If I'm part of you," I said, "then I'm also part of her. Part of everyone you've taken. And that means I can choose which part to embrace." The creature's expression shifted to pure terror as it realized what I meant. A purely human sacrifice wouldn't be enough to banish something this ancient and powerful, but someone who carried the creature's own essence in their blood, someone who could turn that connection against it, could potentially destroy it from within. I crushed the locket in my fist, feeling the metal cut into my skin, feeling Rebecca's hair dissolve into the water around us, and spoke the final words of the ritual. "By the blood that binds us, by the darkness that made us, by the light that guides us home, I choose to be human. I choose love over hunger, connection over consumption, sacrifice over survival. I reject what you are, and I embrace what they were." The creature's scream was like the sound of reality tearing apart at the seam. The water around us began to boil, and I could feel myself being pulled in two directions. Part of me drawn toward the void where the creature was disappearing. Part of me anchored to the world by every human connection I'd ever made. Every moment of love and loss and hope that had shaped me into who I was. The last thing I saw before the pond exploded in blinding light was Rebecca Morrison's face. Not stolen or twisted or corrupted, but free and grateful and proud. She mouthed the word, "Thank you," before dissolving into starlight, and I felt every woman the creature had ever taken flowing me and past me, finally able to move on to whatever came next. When I woke up, I was lying on the shore of what had once been the mill pond. The water was gone, not drained, but somehow transformed back into ordinary earth as if there had never been any water there at all. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely, utterly alone. But it was a good kind of alone. A free kind of alone. Mrs. Hartwell found me there an hour later, wrapped me in a blanket, and drove me back to town in comfortable silence. The cars were gone from the town square, and when I called my mom's phone, it went straight to a number that was no longer in service. It took me 3 weeks to track down what had really happened to my family. Mom had died in a car accident 6 months ago, the same week Melissa had supposedly left for Europe. My aunt had been found dead in her home 2 months later. Apparent suicide, but with no note, no explanation. One by one, I discovered that every family member I thought the creature had brought to Millbrook had actually died months or even years earlier. I was the last one left, the end of the bloodline, the final guardian of a secret that no longer needed keeping. But I wasn't entirely alone. Over the following months, I started hearing from others, descendants of the families who had fled Millbrook in 1955, people who had grown up with the same inexplicable urge to keep moving, the same sense of being watched by something hungry and patient. The creature's destruction had broken whatever hold it had maintained over the scattered bloodlines, and for the first time in 70 years, they were able to stop running. Some came to visit Millbrook, to see the place their grandparents had fled from. Others simply sent letters or emails, sharing family stories that had been passed down in whispers and fragments. Together, we began to piece together the full scope of what had happened, the true extent of the creature's influence over our families. Today marks 1 year since that Halloween night. I've moved to Millbrook permanently, taking over Mrs. Hartwell's position at the bank when she decided to retire to Florida. Someone needs to watch over the town, to make sure no new mysteries take root in the place where so much darkness once lived. Sometimes tourists come asking about the local folklore, drawn by stories they found online about mysterious disappearances and supernatural encounters. I always smile politely and tell them there's nothing special about Millbrook, just a quiet little town where nothing much ever happens anymore. But I keep my great-grandfather's journal in the bank vault, along with a new collection of documents that tell the complete story of what really happened here. Just in case someday someone else needs to know the truth. Just in case there are other places like Millbrook, other creatures that feed on the bonds between people, other families who need to understand why they've been running for generations without knowing why. The Mill Pond site has become something of a local landmark, though not in any official capacity. I've planted wildflowers there, daisies and black-eyed Susans that bloom every spring, creating a natural memorial for all the women who were lost. On quiet evenings, I sometimes walk out there and sit among the flowers, feeling the peace that comes from knowing the nightmare is finally over. Mrs. Hartwell visits occasionally, bringing stories about her new life in a retirement community where she can finally make friends without worrying about keeping terrible secrets. She always asks if I've considered leaving Millbrook, starting fresh somewhere new now that the burden has been lifted. "There's nothing keeping you here anymore," she said during her last visit. "You could go anywhere, be anyone, live a normal life. But I've grown to love this quiet town with its empty storefronts and friendly residents who wave at me from their porches." Millbrook is healing, slowly but surely. New businesses are starting to open: a coffee shop, a used bookstore, a small art gallery run by a woman who moved here from the city seeking a simpler life. The GPS systems have started including us in their routes again, and occasionally we even get tourists who aren't looking for ghost stories or local legends. I've started dating someone, a man named Daniel, who moved to Millbrook to teach at the elementary school. He knows I'm a local historian of sorts, that I'm passionate about preserving the town's heritage and making sure important stories don't get lost. He doesn't know the specific details of what I'm preserving, and maybe someday I'll tell him, or maybe I won't. It's nice to have a relationship that's just normal, uncomplicated by ancient curses or family obligations. The bank vault has become my private archive. In addition to my great-grandfather's journal, I've collected oral histories from the descendants of the fleeing families, old photographs of Millbrook from before the Troubles began, and detailed records of the creature's activities spanning from 1847 to the present day. It's a complete account of one of America's strangest and most well-hidden supernatural incidents, documented with the thoroughness of someone who understands that truth is often stranger and more terrible than fiction. Every Halloween, I hold a small private ceremony at the Mill Pond site. Nothing dramatic or mystical, just a moment of silence for all the lives that were lost, all the families that were scattered, all the people who spent decades running from something they couldn't understand or explain. I light a single candle and let it burn down completely before heading home to hand out candy to the few trick-or-treaters brave enough to venture out in our small town. This past Halloween, something unexpected happened. As I was finishing my ceremony, I noticed a young woman standing at the edge of the flower garden, watching me with obvious curiosity. She was maybe 25, with dark hair and green eyes that looked remarkably familiar. "Excuse me," she said as I approached. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for information about my family history. My grandmother used to tell stories about this place, and I finally decided to come see it for myself." My heart skipped a beat. "What was your grandmother's name?" "Morrison. Elizabeth Morrison. She always said we used to have family in Millbrook, but she could never remember exactly who or when. She had this old photograph." The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a faded picture that made my blood run cold. It was Rebecca Morrison, standing next to the mill pond in 1953, smiling at the camera with bright, innocent eyes. But this photograph was different from the one in my locket. It showed Rebecca with a small child, maybe 2 years old, standing beside her. "That's my great-grandmother," the woman said, "Rebecca Morrison. And the little girl is my grandmother, Elizabeth. Family legend says Rebecca disappeared one day and was never seen again. But Elizabeth always insisted she remembered her mother coming back, just different somehow." I stared at the photograph, my mind racing. If Elizabeth Morrison had been Rebecca's daughter, and this woman was Elizabeth's granddaughter, then, "What's your name?" I asked. "Anna Morrison Chen. I kept my maiden name when I got married. I'm a genealogist." I specialize in helping people trace family histories that have gaps or inconsistencies. A descendant of Rebecca Morrison, the creature's first victim, had returned to Millbrook 70 years after her family fled. But this wasn't a supernatural occurrence or a sign that the nightmare was starting again. This was just a normal woman doing normal genealogical research, drawn by perfectly human curiosity about her family's past. I might be able to help you, I said carefully. I'm something of a local historian. I have records about the Morrison family and what happened to them here. Over coffee at the new cafe on Main Street, I shared what I could. The truth about Rebecca's disappearance and death, the tragedy that had driven her family from Millbrook, the decades of silence that had followed. I didn't mention creatures or supernatural influences, framing it instead as a case of serial killings that had been covered up by local authorities to protect the town's reputation. Anna listened with the careful attention of someone accustomed to hearing difficult family truths. That explains so much, she said when I finished. Why my grandmother always seemed sad when she talked about this place. Why our family never stayed anywhere very long when she was growing up. She used to say she felt like something was always following them, but I thought it was just trauma from losing her mother so young. It was trauma, I said. But sometimes the effects of trauma can last for generations, especially when families don't talk about what happened. Anna spent 3 days in Millbrook, visiting the cemetery where other Morrison family members were buried, taking photographs of locations her grandmother had described in her few stories about the town, and slowly piecing together a family history that had been fragmented by tragedy and fear. On her last day, she stopped by the bank to thank me for my help. I know there's more to the story than what you've told me, she said with a knowing smile. I've been researching local folklore long enough to recognize when someone is editing for content, but I also understand that some family secrets are kept secret for good reasons. She handed me a business card. If you ever decide there are parts of the story that should be preserved more formally, I work with several historical societies that specialize in documenting small-town mysteries. No sensationalism, no exploitation, just careful, respectful preservation of important local history. After Anna left, I spent a long time thinking about what she'd said. For over a year, I'd been keeping the truth about Millbrook locked away in the bank vault, treating it like a dangerous secret that needed to be hidden from the world. But maybe there was value in sharing at least part of the story. Not the supernatural elements that would attract ghost hunters and thrill seekers, but the human elements that might help other families understand their own histories of displacement and loss. I've started writing a book. Nothing dramatic or sensational. Just a careful, academic account of how a series of unexplained disappearances in the 1950s led to the mass exodus of several families from a small American town. I'm framing it as a case study in how trauma can affect multiple generations, how families can be shaped by events they don't fully understand or remember. The supernatural elements will remain safely locked in the bank vault, but the human story, the story of families who spent decades running from something they couldn't name, deserves to be told. There might be other Anna Morrison Chens out there. Other descendants of the scattered families who are searching for answers about why their grandparents were so afraid, why their families never felt safe staying in one place for very long. Daniel has been helping me with the research, tracking down historical records, and conducting interviews with elderly residents who remember the events of the 1950s. He's a good researcher and an even better listener, able to get people to share memories they've kept buried for decades. He still doesn't know the full truth about what I'm really documenting, but his enthusiasm for preserving local history has been invaluable. You know, he said to me last week as we worked through a stack of old newspaper clippings, this story could be important beyond just Millbrook. There are probably dozens of small towns across America that experienced similar population shifts after traumatic events. Understanding how communities process and recover from collective trauma could help other places that are dealing with their own difficult histories. He's right, of course. The human side of what happened in Millbrook, the fear, the exodus, the decades of silence and displacement, is a story that resonates far beyond the supernatural elements that caused it. It's a story about how communities can be shattered by events they don't understand, and how healing can begin when people are finally able to talk about what happened to them. The book is still a work in progress, but I'm hoping to have it finished by next Halloween. It feels appropriate to complete the project on the anniversary of the night, when the nightmare finally ended. Mrs. Hartwell called last week with some unexpected news. She'd been contacted by a publisher who specializes in regional history and folklore, someone who had heard about my research through academic circles and was interested in discussing publication options. You don't have to decide anything right now, she said, but it might be worth considering. The story you're telling, even the edited version, is important. There are families out there who need to understand their own histories, their own patterns of displacement and fear. I've been thinking about her words, about the responsibility that comes with being the keeper of such a significant secret. For over a year, I've focused on making sure the supernatural threat stays buried, but maybe it's time to start thinking about how to help the human survivors, the descendants of the scattered families who are still carrying the psychological scars of their ancestors' trauma. Tomorrow is Halloween again, and I'll perform my usual ceremony at the Mill Pond site. But this year, I think I'll also say a prayer for all the families who are still out there, still running from shadows they don't understand, still carrying the weight of their grandparents' fears. The creature is gone, destroyed completely in that final confrontation. I'm certain of that in a way that goes beyond rational understanding. I can feel its absence like a missing tooth, a space where something terrible used to live. But the human cost of its century-long presence in our world will take much longer to heal. Some inheritances are money, some are property. Mine was a responsibility that cost me everything and everyone I loved, but also gave me the chance to break a cycle of fear and displacement that had affected hundreds of families for multiple generations. I can live with that trade. More than that, I'm proud of it. Tonight, when I light my candle at the Mill Pond site, I'll think about Rebecca Morrison and all the other women who were lost. But I'll also think about Anna Morrison Chen and all the other descendants who are finally free to live normal lives, to put down roots, to build connections without fear. The nightmare is over. The healing has begun. And somewhere in the darkness between what was and what might be, I think Rebecca Morrison is smiling.